Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I took the job because I needed the money. Security gigs weren't exactly hard to come by, but this one had perks: free WWE tickets, backstage access, and a chance to rub shoulders with wrestlers I grew up watching. It wasn't a famous arena, just another stop on the house show circuit, but it had history, the kind of place where the walls held memories, where the air was thick with the sweat and shouts of 1,000 matches before. I was stationed at the backstage corridor, my only task being to make sure no one without clearance entered the locker room area. Pretty easy gig. Wrestlers came and went, laughing, chatting, taping their wrists. Some still had their ring gear on. Others were already halfway through a protein shake and a phone call. By midnight, the place had emptied out. A few guys were still packing up, but most had left for their hotels. The arena was winding down. The hum of the ventilation system was the loudest thing in the building, aside from the occasional clang of equipment being loaded into trucks outside. I leaned against the wall, scrolling through my phone, letting my mind wander. That's when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't loud, just a firm, deliberate knocking. I frowned, looking down the hall. The sound had come from one of the locker rooms, but I knew for a fact that room was empty. I waited. Maybe I imagined it. The sound of equipment cases rolling down the hallway could play tricks on you. Then it came again. Knock, knock. This time louder, more insistent. I shined my flashlight toward the door. The plaque on it read Locker Room B. I took a step forward, swallowing the dry lump forming in my throat. Hello, I called out. My voice echoed slightly in the corridor. No answer. I reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily in my grip. The door swung open with a quiet creak, and I aimed my light inside. The room was empty. Rows of lockers stood silent, doors slightly ajar. A long wooden bench stretched across the center of the room. A few discarded towels lay crumpled on the floor. The air inside was cold, colder than the hallway. Stale, like the scent of old sweat mixed with something I couldn't quite place. I stepped inside, my boots making soft thuds against the tile. Nothing. No open vents. No windows. No way for someone to slip out unnoticed. I exhaled sharply and shook my head. I was just tired. That had to be it. I turned to leave, hand reaching for the light switch, and then something brushed my shoulder. It wasn't a gust of air, not the vent kicking on. It was cold, icy, a whisper of something unseen, trailing across my skin like a breath that didn't belong to me. I spun around so fast my flashlight nearly slipped from my grip. The room was just as empty as before, but I wasn't alone. I felt it, the weight of something watching me, the oppressive stillness in the air. The door slammed shut behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My breath hitched in my throat as I fumbled for the handle, twisting it so hard I thought it might snap off. The door swung open easily, like it had never been closed at all. I didn't look back, didn't check my six, didn't stop until I was halfway down the hallway, heart hammering against my ribs. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe the AC kicked on. Maybe the door swung shut because of a draft. But that cold touch, that whisper of something unseen, that wasn't my imagination. I needed to shake it off. I needed to know if someone had been messing with me. So I asked one of the older crew guys, a roadie who had been working WWE shows longer than I'd been alive. He was sitting near the loading dock, sipping a lukewarm coffee when I brought it up. He set his cup down slowly, stared at me with tired eyes. "That room," he said, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "You sure it was that room?" I nodded. He let out a breath, shaking his head. "Damn." That was when he told me. Years ago, a wrestler died in that very locker room. A mid-card guy. Never quite made it to the top, but respected enough. They found him slumped over the bench after a match, clutching his chest, eyes staring at nothing. Heart attack. Just gone. The eerie part? People had reported hearing knocks on that door ever since. Staff, wrestlers, even a few fans who had snuck backstage. Always late at night. Always after the shows. Like he was still in there. Still waiting for one more match. I never set foot in that hallway alone again. Story 2. Wrestling is a strange business. I've seen guys break bones in the ring and keep going like nothing happened. I've watched men who could barely walk pull off perfect moonsaults under the lights. And I've heard stories that made me wonder if the squared circle was more than just ropes and canvas. This one stuck with me. Back in 2013, I was training at a small wrestling school, trying to get my foot in the door. It was one of those hole-in-the-wall places with peeling posters of past greats on the walls. The kind of gym where the air always smelled like sweat and old leather. We didn't have a ring, just a few old mats, some resistance bands, and an old steel chair that was missing a leg. One night, a former WWE mid-carder stopped by for a seminar. Let's call him Jake. He was in his early 40s, still in good shape, but he had that look in his eyes, like he had seen something he wished he could forget. After the session, a few of us stuck around, peppering him with questions. What was it like being on the road? Who was the stiffest worker? Did WWE ever have real fights backstage? At some point, someone asked, "What's the weirdest thing you've ever seen in the business?" Jake was tying his boots when he froze. His fingers tensed around the laces, and for a long moment, he just stared at the floor. Then, without looking up, he said, "You ever hear about the phantom opponent?" None of us had. Jake exhaled, cracked his knuckles, and leaned back against the ropes. I was working a house show in a smaller town. One of those places where the audience is mostly families and drunk guys in the front row who think wrestling is real. It wasn't a big event, just a filler card before a TV taping. I was in the locker room when one of the producers told me I had a warm-up match before the show. That was weird because I hadn't been scheduled for one, but I didn't argue. Sometimes they throw you in last minute to test a new guy or see how the crowd reacts. I asked who my opponent was. The producer just shrugged and said, "Don't worry about it. Just go out there and call it in the ring." Jake paused, rolling his bottom lip between his teeth. So I went out first. My music hit. I did my entrance. Standard stuff. The crowd was decent, maybe 500-600 people, mostly kids and die-hard fans. I waited in the ring for my opponent's music, and waited. Nothing played. I looked over at the ref. He was just staring at me like he was waiting for something. The commentators at ringside weren't saying anything either, just watching confused. And then the lights flickered. Jake stopped there, licking his lips like his mouth had suddenly gone dry. When they came back on, he was just standing there. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. "Oh," I asked. Jake's eyes flicked up to meet mine. This guy. He was in a dark singlet, old school, like something from the 70s. Black boots, no knee pads, head tilted down so I couldn't see his face. Just standing at the edge of the ring. I waited for the ref to acknowledge him. Maybe check his gear, signal the bell. But the ref didn't do anything. Didn't even look at him. I figured this was some kind of rib. Maybe a local guy they brought in without telling me. So I called out, told him to get in the ring. No response. I took a step forward. Next thing I know, the lights flickered again, and Jake made a sharp snap with his fingers. He was in the ring, inches from me. A few of the guys in the gym laughed nervously, but I didn't. Jake's face was too pale. "What did you do?" I asked. What could I do? He forced a short, humorless laugh. I backed up. My instincts kicked in, and I got into my stance, ready to lock up. But he just stood there, head down. I said, "All right, let's work." Reached out to grab him. And that's when the lights flickered again, and he was gone. The gym was silent. Jake let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. I figured maybe I had just imagined it, a trick of the lights. But then I looked at the ref. He was standing there, staring at me like I'd lost my damn mind. The crowd was dead silent. I turned to the commentators, waiting for some kind of explanation. They were whispering to each other, looking at their notes, confused as hell. I walked backstage, furious. I asked the producer what the hell just happened. "Who was that guy?" He just looked at me and said, "What guy?" I told him about the dark singlet, the old school gear. Told him I wanted to know why the hell my match got pulled last minute. He just stared at me like I was speaking another language. Then he said, "Jake, you didn't have a warm-up match." Jake let that sit for a second. "No one saw him," he said. "Not the ref. Not the commentators. Not the fans. The ring stayed empty the entire time." I swallowed, shifting in my seat. "What about footage?" I asked. Jake let out a sharp breath, like he'd been hoping I wouldn't ask. "I checked," he said. "My entrance was there. You could see me walking to the ring, pacing, looking around, but there was never another guy." He wiped a hand down his face, looking exhausted. Never saw him again after that. Never heard of anyone else seeing him either. But I'll tell you something. When the lights flickered and I saw him standing there, I felt something, and for just a second, I swear to God, I thought he was waiting for me. Jake stood up, grabbed his duffel bag, and slung it over his shoulder. He didn't say goodbye, just walked out the gym doors and into the night. None of us spoke for a long time after that. But that night, when I closed my eyes, I saw it. The flickering lights, the silent crowd, and the figure in the dark singlet, standing at the edge of the ring, waiting. Story 3. You don't expect to see something that breaks reality at a WWE show. The lights, the music, the spectacle, it's all carefully orchestrated. But that night in 2007, sitting front row at SmackDown, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I still think about it. Late at night, when the room is dark and the shadows stretch long across the walls. I wonder if it remembers me too. It started like any other WWE event. The energy in the arena was electric, the air thick with the scent of popcorn, sweat, and the faint metallic buzz of stage lights warming up. The crowd had already seen a few matches, good ones, but nothing compared to what was coming. The moment we'd all been waiting for. The Undertaker. The gong hit, and the arena went dark. Thousands of voices erupted into cheers, but I barely heard them over the deep, resonant hum of that sound. If you've ever been there in person, you know what I mean. It's not just something you hear, it's something you feel vibrating through your chest, your bones. The kind of sound that opens doors best left closed. Then came the first blue light, faint and flickering. The fog started rolling in, curling over the stage like ghostly fingers. I remember gripping the barricade in front of me, my pulse hammering in my throat as the Undertaker emerged. He moved slow, deliberate. Every step was measured, controlled. It was a performance perfected over years, one he could probably do in his sleep. But that night, something was different. I noticed it almost immediately. Behind him, on the massive LED screens that framed the entrance ramp, his shadow loomed larger than life. That wasn't unusual. The bright blue light cast everything in deep contrast. But as he moved, the shadow didn't follow. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Maybe the screens were lagging. I told myself it was nothing, but then it tilted its head, not in sync with him, not like a shadow should. I felt my stomach clench, a creeping cold spreading through my limbs. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes as if that would change what I was seeing. The Undertaker took another step forward. The shadow didn't. It stood frozen on the screen, a dark, hulking silhouette with that unmistakable wide-brimmed hat. Then, as he continued down the ramp, the shadow smiled. A slow, terrible grin, stretching wider than any human mouth should. I swear to God, it knew I was looking at it. My breath caught in my throat. My hands clenched the metal barricade so hard my knuckles turned white. I turned to the guy next to me, nudging him. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He looked at me like I was crazy. His eyes flickered to the screen, then back to me. "See what?" I wanted to point, to tell him to look harder, but my body wouldn't move. Because the shadow was moving again, not following the Undertaker, not mirroring him. It was moving on its own. It raised one slow, curling hand, long fingers extending toward the man in the ring. But the Undertaker never reacted. He didn't see it. And then, in a blink, it snapped back into place. Perfectly normal. A second later, the arena lights came up slightly, and the match began. The energy returned. People cheered. Everything seemed fine. But I wasn't fine. I felt cold, like something had been drained from me. When I finally convinced my body to move, I pulled out my phone. My hands trembled as I scrolled to my video. I hit play. The entrance played out exactly as I remembered, but on my screen, the shadow moved normally. It followed his every step, perfectly synced. No delay, no head tilt, no grin. I rewound, watched again, and again. It wasn't there. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin, stretched impossibly wide, like something was wearing his shape, but didn't know how to be human. I tried to forget about it. I really did. But a few months later, I found myself digging through old wrestling forums, looking for anything similar. I didn't expect to find anything, but buried deep in a forgotten thread, I did. A post from 2004. Someone who had been at a live event, different city, different year. They had seen the same thing. The Undertaker's shadow. It wasn't right. It moved on its own. I swear it looked at me, and then it smiled. I clicked the username. The account no longer existed. I never went to another WWE event after that. I kept watching from home, but it was never the same, because sometimes late at night, when my TV screen is black, I swear I see something standing behind me. And sometimes I think it's smiling.